You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. When we up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, summary episode number 4, The British Empire. This time we will be summarizing episodes 86 through 91 on the British Empire during the interwar years. The Empire was in an interesting position as it exited the First World War. It had never been larger, with the territory gained either outright or as mandates, taking the empire on which the sun never set to a new level in terms of size. But at the same time, there were new problems that leaders in London would have to try and find answers for in the brave new world of the interwar years. This episode will focus on some of these problems, which can be broadly grouped into 3 different categories. There were challenges at home, which were amplified by the Great Depression. There were challenges of empire, as discussions began to occur about what the long-term future of the empire would be. And then there were challenges faced in British foreign policy and in military preparedness. But as always, our story starts with the First World War. The British had won the First World War along with their allies, but the conflict had put a new level of strain on British society. Before the entry of the Americans into the conflict in 1917, the British were quite simply running out of money after using both their reserves and their reputation to bankroll the Allied war effort for the first 3 years of the conflict. At the end of the war, the British were in no way destitute. Now, this was far from kind of the economic challenges that they would face after the Second World War. But one thing was clear: the center of world finance had for the first time in generations began to at least somewhat drift away from London. The empire still had several key economic advantages though. For one thing, it had the largest merchant fleet in the world, which helped British companies to best utilize the access they had to resources all over the globe thanks to the connections built on the empire. The end of the First World War also led to cuts in spending and a general kind of economic downturn, just like it would in every country that participated in the First World War. And this would cause ripples throughout the British economy that would heal just in time for the nation to run into what the British called the Big Slump, also known as the Great Depression. The Great Depression hit the United Kingdom quite hard, especially in the areas of general employment, which with the peak of UK unemployment reaching about 23%. This was very similar to what happened in many of the more economically advanced nations around the world. But then the British did something that in retrospect was a very good move. They left the gold standard. The gold standard was the idea that currencies of nations should be tied to a fixed exchange rate between their currency and gold. It had been a major part of kind of economic orthodoxy before the Great Depression. There were benefits to the standard. For example, it took much of the risk out of any kind of international currency conversion because you could always just count on the money being backed by gold. The larger European nations had all went off the gold standard during the First World War, due to the spending required to prosecute the conflict. But the assumption was always that they would go back to the standard once the conflict was over, and the date of transition back to the gold standard was set to the end of 1925. Unfortunately for everyone involved, there were many problems with the gold standard at this time, with countries making mistakes about how they valued their currency at the time that the standard was enacted, which caused trade issues, and then also the fact that it sometimes made economic expansion difficult because it was difficult to gather funds for large capital investments, which were often needed to, partake in large economic activities. This was one of the constraints on British industrial investments during the late 1920s. But the departure of the British pound from the gold standard solved a lot of the problems, with the British pound falling against other currencies, which actually improved the British economic position because it made British exports more attractive on the international market. A greater demand for British exports meant more work for British workers at home, more production, more investment, less unemployment. All of those were good things. It would still take years for the British economy to properly recover from what happened in the first years of the 1930s, but it was clearly on the right course by the mid-1930s, just at a time when demands would be made upon it for rearmament. While the British economy was evolving, the British Empire was doing the same. The Empire is kind of an interesting topic to discuss, particularly as it evolved during the interwar years, but it's also important to remember what is described in this excellent quote from Alan Allport from his excellent book, Britain at Bay, which everybody should read. Quote, "It is difficult now to remember just what a permanent fixture the British Empire once seemed. It was still one of the great facts of the world in the 1930s, impossible to miss, older than anyone could remember, and apparently indestructible." End quote. Now, of course, this was all about to change. We know that this is all about to change. Because even though the British Empire was larger in 1921 than it had ever been, well, times were changing. The first major domino to fall would be at the 1926 Imperial Conference, where the Balfour Declaration would restructure pieces of the British Empire, giving some of those pieces much more autonomy within the empire, with the name the Commonwealth being adopted at this time. Now, this did not give the pieces like Canada or Australia or New Zealand or South Africa sort of full independence, but it did shift the official hierarchy away from strict United Kingdom dominance into at least officially a collection of equal pieces of empire. For many of the areas that were now within the Commonwealth, this transition was smooth and would remain the cornerstone of their relations with London for the next several decades. But then there was India. India was a sticky topic during the interwar years. There were movements in India led by leaders like Gandhi that wanted much greater autonomy for the people of India, with the ability to rule themselves. But there were many traditionalists in London who, fueled by kind of racist beliefs about the capabilities of Indians, did not believe that the Indians were even capable of self-rule. Now, if this disagreement had not resulted in so much violence, both real and verbal, throughout the interwar years, it would almost be funny, but it's not because of the violence, that when the Government of India Bill was finally passed in 1937, the British officials in India started to work with Indian nationalists, people who had years before pushed so strongly for independence, and actually things went really well with them. Like, it was a kind of a smooth transition, at least at the beginning. The Indians were more than willing to take a more slow and methodical path towards full independence, instead of immediately seeking to kind of tear down the systems that existed. And this is interesting, if for no other reason than the racists in London would once again, not for the first, not for the last time, be proved to be completely incorrect in their judgment about another group of people, especially one, all the way around the world. Funny how that would just keep happening, and especially after 1941.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
with the ongoing conversations about the exact relationships between the internal pieces of the empire, the external threats to the empire would see some wild swings during the interwar years. One important aspect that would loom over British military and foreign policy during these years was the idea of the 10-year rule, which was put in place in the early 1920s and would be in effect until the early 1930s. This was simply a rule that the British military arms should plan their kind of spending and their structures and their kind of organization on the assumption that there would not be a major European conflict for 10 years, which drastically changed how they prepared and maintained their forces. While this would eventually be dropped in the early 1930s, it did still result in a kind of atrophy among the military arms during the 1920s that would take time and money to fix in the decade that followed. In Europe, the existing structures that had been formed during the Paris Peace Conference continued, with the British and French still maintaining good relations and cooperations, even if the British were kind of less committed to that cooperation than maybe the French were. In Eastern Europe, the British government was supportive of the new nations that were created from the old empires. However, they were far less willing to commit themselves to actions in that region because many leaders in London, not totally incorrectly, did not believe that there was a direct sort of tie between Britain and those areas. They just didn't believe it was that important. Economic relations with both Germany and the Soviet Union would sort of restore quite quickly after the war and were beneficial to the British economy during the 1920s. And sort of everything kind of seemed to be trending back towards normality until the 1930s happened. During the decade before the start of the Second World War, the British government and military was faced with a long list of competing concerns and threats that would stretch British resources thin and require some compromises that would cause issues once the fighting started in 1939. Before we get to that, though, we have to talk about the naval treaties, which were a critical component of British foreign policy in the 1920s. In the years after the First World War, it appeared very likely that three nations would enter into a naval arms race that would be even larger than the Anglo-German naval arms race that had preceded the First World War. The three prospective participants were the British, Japanese, and Americans. All three of these countries believed that maintaining a level of naval control around the world was an essential part of their future, sort of as a nation, and so the stakes in any arms race was going to be very high, until they all agreed to come together and find a diplomatic solution. This resulted in the Washington Naval Treaty, which saved all of those involved from having to commit huge sums of money into naval construction over the following decade. The agreements that were made allowed the British and Americans to maintain rough parity between their fleets, with the Japanese allowed 60% of the total of either of the other powers. Some of the secondary naval powers also joined into the agreement, with their own force levels agreed to in that treaty at some ratio between the British and Americans and themselves. While this prevented another naval arms race, it was very possible that the British would have lost, it also put a hard cap on how many ships the Royal Navy could have, a cap that was adjusted and renewed at the London Naval Conference in 1930. This was not really a problem during the 1920s, though. It was a huge benefit during the 1920s because they could spend less money on the Navy, because many nations at that time were still simply recovering from the previous war and were not yet looking towards the next conflict. But then during the mid-1930s, everything began to change, and suddenly the British had to find a way to deal with a whole list of possible enemies. We'll start that list in Europe, where the rise of antagonism between Britain and both Germany and Italy was a major problem. Both of these nations represented a major threat to core British interests. On the German side, they sort of presented the classic problem of one nation dominating the European continent, something that the British did not want. They kind of would have preferred peace to be maintained on the continent so that they could focus on different challenges, but that had to involve one nation not being in control. They didn't need or want another Napoleon. Then the Germans made it known that they planned on building out their naval power, absolutely the last thing that the British wanted. And so they signed the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Arms Treaty, which did remove some of the limitations that had been placed upon German naval construction by the Versailles Treaty. But from the British perspective, it accomplished the very important goal of putting a cap on the size of the German Navy, at least in the near term. This cap on German building was very important because there was a greater threat to British interests in Europe, Italy. Italy was in a position to control the very important Mediterranean, a body of water that was seen as the second most important area for British naval power, after the areas around the home islands, because the Mediterranean ensured the connection between Europe and India through the Suez Canal. The antagonism with Italy almost resulted in a war in the mid-1930s over the actions taken by the Italians in Ethiopia. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed around the Abyssinian crisis, as it was known. And really, the threat from Italy would have been manageable, if not for the fact that it was just one of many nations that seemed to be moving into position to threaten British interests around the world. The biggest problem was the growing threat posed by Japan. During the First World War, the Japanese had been allied with Britain and France, hoping to use that support to expand their control in the Pacific after the war. Then after the war, any conflict was delayed, but only delayed, by agreements made with the Washington Naval Treaty. By the time that the treaties were set to expire in the mid-1930s, it was clear that the Japanese were going to exit the treaty system, which many Japanese saw as unfair due to the lower number of ships that the Japanese were allowed to build. Once they did that, once they exited the treaties, it seemed only a matter of time before there was some kind of conflict between the British and the Japanese around both of the empire's interests in Southeast Asia. In previous decades, maybe the threat of war would not have been seen as such a concern for the British, but by the 1930s it was a major problem because there were just too many military threats around the world for the British to be able to respond to all of them. In Europe, Germany and Italy demanded a response and demanded resources, while in the Pacific the Japanese did the same. One of the ways that the British tried to solve this problem was through massive investments in the fortifications around Singapore, with the hope that it could serve as a point of British strength in the region where a British force could hold out and wait for a fleet to arrive from Europe. But everybody knew this was just one part of the equation, because to defend a worldwide empire, you have to be able to send forces to pieces of that empire, and so the answer to those problems was to start a massive building program for the Royal Navy, which would happen in 1937. During the last years before the start of the war, the British would begin a building program that was unheard of at that time, with more aircraft carriers, battleships, and smaller ships under construction than any other nation. This would put the Royal Navy on the course to be able to rule the waves in the same way that they had done before the First World War. But then the war intervened, and many of those construction programs were put on hold. Even with the increased building tempo from the pre-war years, the Royal Navy simply did not have enough ships to cover the entire globe, and so the plan was for the bulk of the strength of the fleet to be kept in European waters, split between the home islands and the Mediterranean. Then, in case of Japanese aggression, a fleet would be put together that could then sail to the rescue of Singapore, or at least that was the stated plan. As the situation developed in the years before the start of the war, it was unlikely that a large enough fleet could have been collected fast enough to reach Singapore in time, especially as the tension in Europe continued to rise, which would have tied more and more resources to European waters. So if the Royal Navy was stretched thin by all of these concerns all around the world, what about the other arms of the British military? The Army was a clear third in terms of importance when it came to the defense budgets for the British, although there were moments during the interwar years where they would be in a position of leadership when looking at potential enemies. This was most apparent in the late 1920s, when many of the other armies of Europe were actually reading the writings and the results of exercises of British armor and mobile units when they were trying to determine their own doctrine for future armored divisions. At that time, the British were very clearly way ahead of everybody else in terms of especially armored unit kind of theory on how to use them on the battlefield. However, major budget cuts that were put in place due to the Great Depression meant that the British Army would lose all of its leadership in these areas before 1939. While the Army was a clear third in terms of investment, there was kind of the recognition that the British would have to have a force available for dispatch to the continent, much like the BEF had been dispatched in 1914, and this resulted in the creation of the Field Force. The problem was, and always would be, funding, because it was difficult for the Army to make a case for funding when the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were also struggling to meet their own goals and to provide for their own areas of defense, which were seen as more important to the overall safety of the British Empire. These views would begin to shift after Munich, and a large funding injection would be made into the Army at that time, But as with everything, it would take time to bear fruit, and time was running out. While the British Army was at times starved of resources, one of the benefits of this was that more funding could be given over to the Royal Air Force. The RAF was one of the first truly independent air arms in any military around the world, having been created at the end of the First World War. This independence was not just a paper move either, and the fact that the RAF was completely free of Army and Navy influence during the interwar years was an important aspect of how British air power developed. The RAF was very concerned with this independence and would do everything in its power to retain that independence and to fortify that independence over the course of the 1920s and 30s. For example, during the interwar years, there would be attempts at using the RAF and air power to make the maintenance of peace around the empire cheaper and easier, with policing from the air used in the Middle East to somewhat mixed results. But the big idea was that the RAF focused its efforts on trying to make it seem like it was necessary for it to be independent and that it could serve an important function within the empire, even in times of peace, or at least not in times of war with other great powers. But also during this time, the RAF would focus a lot of its efforts on strategic bombing. Much like other air forces, many within the RAF believed that wars could be won through strategic bombing, and so they advocated for resources to be spent on the RAF's bombing capabilities. I won't go into full discussion of strategic bombing here, because a summary of that topic sort of was in last week's summary episode, but I will just say that the important impact this had on the RAF is that when combined with its structural independence from the Army, it meant that there was a strong desire to not subordinate the RAF to the concerns of the fighting on the ground. It was also politically important that the RAF should be seen as a cheap, safe alternative to a massive army, and the idea of strategic bombing as a way to win wars would have advocates as high as the Prime Minister when Chamberlain's government led the British into the war. It was seen as the way of the future, the better way, the less costly way, the way that I guess was as far away from the trenches of the Western Front as was possible, which was still important for British war planning because they did not want to end up in that situation again. The final topic to chat about here in the summary episode is around British views on appeasement. This topic has been very controversial since the very moment that the ink was still probably wet on the Munich Agreement that was signed between Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, which essentially dismembered Czechoslovakia, who did not have representatives in the room when that agreement was signed. When they made the agreement, Britain and France sort of sacrificed Czechoslovakia, all in the name of delaying a possible European war. Appeasement, in general, was just the concept that regardless of what Hitler and other leaders were saying around Europe, they could be negotiated with, and if their grievances were answered with concessions, then war could at the very least be postponed, maybe even prevented entirely. Proponents of appeasement measures would claim that all efforts needed to be made to ensure peace and to prevent another war on the scale of the conflict from 1914 to 1918. And even if appeasement just resulted in delay, that was critical because the British and the French and other nations that were aligned with them were very much not prepared for a war, and any time that they could delay a war would mean that they would have more time for those preparations for the rearmament efforts that had started in the mid-1930s, but which were clearly behind that of Germany and Italy. Opponents of appeasements would claim that a war was going to happen anyway, and any concessions made to Germany during the period of appeasement would just bring them more advantages, and also, it was just the wrong thing to do. The people of Czechoslovakia probably would have agreed with this idea. The more you give to Hitler, the more he's just gonna take. But of course, nobody consulted them. While the apex of appeasement would be at Munich, there would be other examples of the concept in action and possible negotiations afterward, although the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939 basically ended British and French efforts at negotiating with German leaders. While appeasement was a controversial topic at the time, it remains one to this very day. If you go online, you will find those who support both sides, although the most prominent opinion, at least that I've seen, is that it was probably a necessary evil due to the volume of rearmament that occurred between Munich and the start of the war. although given the performance of the British and French armies in 1940, it was clearly not enough. Now, I don't often openly talk about my views on this podcast, but I get asked about this one a lot, so I'll just kind of talk a little bit about it here, sort of with full hindsight clarity. I have come to believe that it probably could not have gone worse if the war had started in 1939. The British and French armies probably could not have performed worse. Things probably could not have went as badly for them as they would in 1939 and 1940. And at least then, the Germans would have been distracted by Czechoslovakia for some period of weeks, maybe months. And then they would also have to deal with Poland, who would also have a head start on preparing for the war. So I think that while it's valid that there were meaningful steps made in terms of preparing for the conflict between Munich and the invasion of Poland, those steps probably could have still happened had the war been ongoing. And again, you have to kind of balance it against the fact that things went so poorly in 1940, they have to go somehow even worse in 1938 for it not to be worth sort of standing by Czechoslovakia from a political perspective, from a manpower perspective, from a sort of statement perspective. It would have really changed how the first couple of campaigns of the Second World War would have happened. So I kind of come down on the idea that appeasement was a bad idea, but I understand why people did it. I understand why the Munich Agreement was signed. And I also understand that my evaluation is based on hindsight that they didn't have, because they didn't know that the invasion of France was going to be a horrible disaster that would be over in a matter of weeks. So to summarize this summary episode here at the end, the British Empire was facing some real challenges as war approached in 1939, but it was taking many of the steps required to build up the forces necessary to meet those challenges. They would simply run out of time. And then after the war started, their situation would only get worse for several years before it then turned around, and they would eventually be victorious. So I guess you can't criticize them too much. It worked out in the end. Although you can't help but feel that there had to have been a better way.